Hello and welcome to this edition of Cato Connects, a special School Choice Week edition of Cato Connects. I'm Caleb Brown. I'm the Director of Multimedia here at the Cato Institute. Tonight we're talking about a particular school choice reform that was adopted in New Hampshire in 2012. That is scholarship tax credits, a program that allows low to moderate income parents to get a little extra boost as they consider the education options for their children. And I'll be talking tonight with three people who played a pretty big role in this program. Jim Forsythe is a former New Hampshire state senator and sponsor of the legislation that eventually became this tax credit program. Jason Bedrick is an education policy analyst at the Cato Institute and notably a former state lawmaker in the state of New Hampshire. And Dick Komer is a senior attorney at the Institute for Justice who fought on behalf of this program at the New Hampshire Supreme Court. We'll be taking your questions via Twitter. Until then, please enjoy Live Free and Learn.
Lenny was facing going into 7th grade, and our local junior high school is atrocious. You know, it's just, I didn't want her in there.
Thomas's elementary school did a good job meeting his educational needs. We were concerned, however, that the same level of attention to his educational needs wouldn't be met at the next level.
Public schools sometimes don't have the resources or time to sort of dive deeper into what a student might be passionate about.
Families are generally assigned to a school by zip code, as you know, and those zip codes tell you what school you're going to go to.
We shouldn't expect that any one school will best meet the needs of all the children who just happen to live in a certain geographic area.
You don't get the ability to opt out of those schools because you don't have the financial resources to access the private education marketplace the way your wealthier peers do. And because you're there involuntarily and can't leave, we don't have to ensure that we give you an education worth
In 2011, New Hampshire State Senator Jim Forsythe began work on what would become a major education reform in his state.
So the education tax credit bill is a bill that helps needy children go to the school of their choice, whether that's a local public school that's out of district or homeschooling or the private school of their choice.
Families that can move to a different district or can afford to pay for their children to go to private school kind of already have this built in, right, this in place. But families that otherwise couldn't afford those options are stuck.
The program works like this. Corporate taxpayers in New Hampshire make donations to scholarship organizations, nonprofits that provide assistance to parents that wanted to send their children to a new school. Low-income parents could choose private schools, religious schools, even homeschooling or another public school. The corporations, for their part, would receive a tax credit of 85% of the donation amount. It's not unlike taking a tax deduction for a charitable gift. The scholarship organizations would fund students to the tune of about $2,500 each, some more and some less, depending on need. It was the first school choice program that included specific provisions for parents who wanted to homeschool their children.
Adam Schaefer from Cato Institute showed us how that homeschooling could be added into the tax credit program and the legislation. We immediately jumped on that as an option for this program.
If a parent chooses to homeschool their children, which is a significant commitment on a parent's part, I think people felt they wanted to make some sort of an assistance there to allow you, again, as many options as possible. It's significant because previously I think people had thought, well, we can't do anything for homeschoolers.
We were the first in the country. My understanding is we have a number of families that have benefited from being able to take that as an option for their family. What was holding them back, believe it or not, was the cost of the materials.
The program endured an intense battle in New Hampshire's legislature.
I went to St. Lazarus School as a kid. I went to St. Joseph's School. My parents didn't get any tax credit.
I do rise in opposition to this amendment. But this is wrong. It's unconstitutional.
What this is about is some basic fairness. It's about the good of competition.
we should be doing more for public education, not finding ways to withdraw from public education.
This is an opportunity which is going to save our community's money and provide an opportunity for people that don't have it today.
You're ruining the very basis of our society.
There are roughly 31,000 private school students in New Hampshire. Those parents have donated around $470 million to the public school system in reduced education costs. And we're squabbling about giving a few $2,500 scholarships back?
Make a choice. Pay for it. Pay for that choice.
Over a governor's veto, the program started in 2013, but opponents continued their fight. The program survived a repeal effort by a single vote in the Senate in the next legislative session.
So when I saw that legislation pass, I knew that I wanted to start a scholarship organization. And so January 2013, which really was the first day that I could file the paperwork to become a scholarship organization, I did that. And I was approved by the Department of Revenue in January of 2013, and I've been doing the work ever since.
I connected with Kate through email because I had some questions initially about the program and wondering if we were a family that might fit.
Brandon Fide is a single dad and a public school teacher in New Hampshire and a recipient of a scholarship from NEO. The scholarship made the difference of being able to send his daughter Alika to Kimball Union Academy in northern New Hampshire.
Right now, that tax scholarship represents a choice for us, and I think that as a parent, I really value having that choice. I knew that it would be the best option for her with her personality and many other things, but I didn't know if we'd be able to afford it. So at that point, when the program started to take shape, I thought, well, if that is a way that might help me fund her education, I'm all for it. The small classes, the variety of classes, the high expectations for academics, I think all of that has been great.
I'm taking Spanish and Chinese, and I don't think I'd be able to do that anywhere else, so I think that's really great and unique. This is the first year where I've been excited to go to class, and I want to learn and I want to see my teachers, which I don't think I'd be excited. I wasn't excited to go to class last year, so it's really different.
We knew when he was about 2 years old, when he learned his alphabet, learned all the states and capitals, we knew that he was different. And we wanted to make sure that he thrived in whatever academic environment he was in, whether it's public school, homeschool, or private school.
Earl and Alice Tucson are engineers by training. They now run Red Man's Farm in Loudon Center, New Hampshire. Their oldest son, Thomas, attends the Beach Hill School, thanks in part to the scholarship program.
We attended a school choice event about a year ago, and that's how we found Beach Hill School.
The pace is better for me. It's not really slow. It was in my old school. And they also go a lot more in depth.
Without the scholarship, Thomas would have attended a different school that we didn't feel would have been quite as good a fit for him.
Lenny was facing going into 7th grade, and our local junior high school is atrocious. It's just, I didn't want her in there, so she was looking at maybe homeschooling again, and she didn't want to do that. So I said, why not, we'll apply for the private school.
Sonia Bruladakis is a married mother of 5 in Manchester. The scholarship helped the Bruladakises send their oldest daughter, Eleni, to nearby Liberty Harbor.
They do a classical education. It's more based on history and language arts.
Within a month, we had to give a $1,000 deposit. So I have nowhere to wear. I didn't have it. So I gathered up my jewelry and my engagement ring and my mother's jewelry, because I said, my mother would value Eleni getting an education more than me holding on to her diamond, So I sold those things and I made the deposit.
Families make incredible sacrifices for their children. I mean, your children are your top priority, okay? And particularly families that have challenges understand that they want their children to succeed and be in a position that's better than the position that they're in.
I was on like a mission. I was going to just sell whatever, anything of value that I had so that we could just pay down the tuition, and so it would bring the monthly payments down once we got going. But then a couple weeks later, Kate called my husband and said, "Oh, we'll pay the rest of your tuition for you." And I just was like, oh, you know, what a blessing, what a gift.
In the first year of scholarship tax credits, the program received more than 1,000 applications from parents. NEO, then the only scholarship organization in operation, awarded more than $128,000 to more than 100 students from 62 families. And just a few months into the program, the Cato Institute's Jason Bedrick conducted the first survey of how parents reacted to the scholarships and their children's new schools.
Our survey found that parents were overwhelmingly satisfied. 97% of parents said that they were satisfied or very satisfied with their chosen home or private school. Even within the first 3 months, nearly 70% of families reported that they saw measurable improvement in their child's academic performance.
Last year I raised $250,000 for scholarships, and of that I was actually able to use about half, and unfortunately I had to return half.
It's like an IED, an explosive device planted in our school system that goes off slowly over a period of years.
Opponents filed a lawsuit attempting to have the program thrown out by the courts. The lead plaintiff in the case of Duncan v. New Hampshire was local businessman Bill Duncan. The suit claimed the money donated to scholarship organizations was actually public money, and the program therefore would violate the state's constitution. Duncan received representation from Americans United for Separation of Church and State and the ACLU. Duncan, his attorneys, and other plaintiffs declined to be interviewed for this film.
New Hampshire Constitution has a Blaine Amendment, which says you can't take taxpayer money and spend it on religious schools. So that's the argument that they made, that this is taxpayer money, and that's exactly why they kept calling it a voucher over and over again.
Voucher system, voucher program, voucher system, voucher, the voucher children, the voucher bill.
Because they wanted to make that argument, well, it's not a voucher program, it's a tax credit program.
At trial, Duncan prevailed in part. The trial court prohibited religious schools from receiving scholarship students, and Kate Baker had to return more than $100,000 to corporate donors.
What they said was we can't give scholarships to a family who want to use them at a religious school. And that did eliminate a very large part of our applicants. So we weren't able to help a lot of families that needed help and had to return some of that money because of this legal battle. I, of course, hope justice will prevail in New Hampshire very soon, and I'll be able to help families regardless of their beliefs. I've never discriminated against someone. I don't want to start now.
There is a distinction to be made between direct appropriations made by the legislature and awarding tax credits to private individuals to incentivize certain activity.
As the case moved to the New Hampshire Supreme Court, Dick Komer at the Institute for Justice intervened on behalf of parents.
There are no state appropriations under a tax credit program. It operates the same as the tax deductions we're much more familiar with, or the tax exemptions that we're familiar with.
Using that tax credit structure, it resolves a lot of the issues that some of the earlier programs have had, while nonetheless preserving a parental choice and allowing for maybe the maximum level of freedom and opportunity to use the scholarship essentially anywhere.
In 2011, the U.S. Supreme Court dealt with exactly this issue. Does the existence of scholarship tax credits make the scholarship funds public funds? The Supreme Court said that until the money enters the public treasury, it's not public money.
The Arizona Supreme Court case was clear that tax credits are not taxpayer money.
If you can't have the tax credits that help parents, how can you have a tax exemption which directly benefits churches and religious schools, among other charitable organizations? It would be a colossal undermining of what New Hampshire has always accepted as legitimate legislative activity.
This is case 2013-0455, Bill Duncan et al. Versus the State of New Hampshire et al.
It's your position that none of the plaintiffs have standing in this case, right?
Yes, sir. That's absolutely right.
And why?
This program uses the state tax system
to divert funding away from public schools to religious schools.
You know, local property taxes or whatever, that's okay?
The very facts in this case tell you what proportion of schools, the private educational institutions in New Hampshire, remain religious. And many of them are. Somewhere over 50% of them are. And they receive direct aid from the tax exemptions that New Hampshire has awarded from time immemorial.
If the lawsuit prevails, what happens to the students that NEO is currently helping?
So education tax credits have already been to the U.S. Supreme Court and been proven to be constitutional. I think justice will prevail in the New Hampshire Supreme Court, and that the Supreme Court will agree with the U.S. Supreme Court and other Supreme Courts across the nation that it's constitutional.
If the opponents of this program prevail, what happens to the students that NEO is in the process of helping? No answer?
I'd like to spin positive.
I understand that.
Yeah, and I don't want to put my resume together, Caleb, and not be able to help families. My intention is to help them to be able to get the education that they need for their children.
It would be an enormous, enormous transfer of power from private individuals to the government. The government would now essentially be able to control everything. And the motto of New Hampshire, live free or die, would become some sort of ironic footnote in history, because now the government would own everything.
In a unanimous decision, the New Hampshire Supreme Court threw out Duncan's lawsuit, stating that Duncan and the other petitioners could not show that they had suffered a personal injury as a result of the scholarship program. Alika Fide is now a sophomore at Kimball Union Academy. Her father, Brandon, says the scholarship program continues to allow him to send her to the school of his choice. Thomas Tucson is now in 7th grade at the Beach Hill School. Alice and Earl Tucson hope to send their 2 other sons to Beach Hill with assistance from a scholarship. Eleni Bruladakis did not return to Liberty Harbor in 2014. Her mother, Sonia, blames the lawsuit. Eleni now attends a just-opened charter school in Manchester. Bill Duncan was appointed to the New Hampshire State Board of Education on May 8, 2014. All right, thank you for watching Live Free and Learn, Scholarship Tax Credits in New Hampshire. Austin Bragg and I got to spend about a week in New Hampshire shooting a lot of that and enjoyed a great deal of it, and got to meet and talk to Jim Forsythe, who is a former New Hampshire state senator and also the sponsor of the legislation that became the scholarship program in New Hampshire. So, Jim, if you don't mind, describe what the politics were like before this program, you started working on this program.
Sure. Before I do that, I'll just acknowledge Greg Hill was in the House,
Absolutely.
and he was the big, huge help in the House in terms of writing the bill. So the situation was interesting because we had overwhelming Republican support in both the House and the Senate. But we had a Democratic governor, and so early on we were trying to get him to not veto because we were confident we could pass a school choice bill, but we weren't so confident that we could pass it and override a veto. But near the tail end, he did still veto it, and so we had to work to get that veto override numbers, which we were always working towards, and that was the big challenge.
And that was pretty close.
It was pretty close, and we did not have a veto-proof majority when the bill first came over from the House. So, you know, there was a Senate bill and a House bill, and once those passed and swapped houses, we didn't have a veto-proof majority coming out of the House. And part of the reason was, you know, a prominent fiscal conservative in the House had spoken out against the bill because of his concern about impact to the local taxpayers, the property taxpayers, because this was a bill focused on state aid, And so they were concerned about that. And so we did some things in the bill to address that concern and get it up to a veto-proof majority.
If you have a question for any of our guests here, Jim Forsythe, former New Hampshire State Senator and sponsor of the legislation that we discussed in the film Live Free and Learn, Jason Bedrick, Education Policy Analyst here at the Cato Institute, and Dick Komer, a Senior Attorney at the Institute for Justice. You can use the hashtag CatoConnects on Twitter, and we'll try to get to as many of your questions over the next half hour or so. So, Jason Bedrick, we made note of the fact that you were a New Hampshire state representative, which, as I came to find out when I visited New Hampshire, isn't really all that impressive.
It's about, I think, 1 in 3 people in the state are, there's 400 members of the House in a state of 1.3 million people. So it's actually roughly 1 for every 3,300 people. So it's by far the most representative legislative body in the world.
Okay, so you are a student of education policy, and you were no longer in the State House when this program was actually moving forward, but what was your role?
While I was at graduate school, I was a fellow at the Josiah Bartlett Center for Public Policy, and so I worked with Jim and Greg Hill and a number of other legislators, and my predecessor at Cato, Adam Schaefer, on designing the bill and studying scholarship tax credit programs around the country, sort of figure out best practices and figure out what we could do in New Hampshire.
All right, so this was quite a concerted effort of a few fairly committed people to handle objections and deal with it, but what were, separate from what we saw in the film, what were some of the big objections that were raised by people who felt that this was radical or problematic in some way?
Well, there was kind of 2 groups of people. This was a very partisan issue, so Democrats by and large didn't support it, although there was a House member that did. And a lot of that opposition, I think, comes from, that party enjoys a wide support from teachers' unions. And so they didn't want to hang their neck out, and so they were getting a push to oppose this from the teachers' unions, I think. There wasn't, I mean, the big objection from them was this is going to destroy public education. And I think if public education can't take at least a little bit of competition, then that's a pretty sad state of affairs if somehow a $2,500 tax credit can compete with $16,000 taxpayer funding of a public school.
All right, we have a couple of questions here on Twitter. Matthew K. Tabor asks, what was the most compelling, effective selling point in trying to convince legislators that the tax credit was a good idea? And both of you, I think, could speak to that.
I think that wasn't actually the hard part. I think, so I think it's something like 70% of Americans understand, the school choice movement and that it makes sense. So the selling point really was to address people's fears and concerns about it. What is it going to impact the taxpayer negatively somehow by shifting the burden? Are there going to be enough protections in something like this? And that's where you have to really start to help them understand that public schools have regulation because, you have to go to them. You can't pull your money out. Private schools don't have the regulation. They have the best form of regulation, which is the parents. If it's not meeting their needs, they can pull them out. So,
I think there was any one argument that was the selling point. I mean, you had a body of 400 legislators, and that's just the one side. And there were 36, I think, right in the Senate. And so there were a number of different reasons, a number of different concerns that people had. But we had spoken with a legislator from Oklahoma, Representative Jason Nelson. They had passed a scholarship tax credit program there. And he told us that the way they did it is they were able to answer every single question. So whenever something would come up and we didn't have the answer yet, we would put our heads together, research it, figure it out, and then we put together a frequently asked questions list, which, I mean, grew and grew. It was over 17 pages by the end. There were 3 different sessions that we held in front of legislators and just sat there sometimes for an hour or 2 just answering questions from legislators and until they were satisfied that we had the answers. But I think the most important thing, to answer Matt's question, that we emphasized was that different kids have different needs. And it doesn't make sense in the 21st century to have an education system where children are assigned to a school just based on the home that their parents can happen to afford. That some, 80% of kids in a given district, that school may work great for, but there may be 20% or even just 10% that school is not great for those kids. And so we want to expand the options for kids. And most people seem to agree with that. The only question was really logistically, how do we do it? And is it going to have a negative impact on the public schools? When they were satisfied that it was best for everybody, then they were for it.
All right, we have another question from Gus LaFontaine. What primary challenges might other states face if they sought to adopt similar legislation? And I would like you to chime in on this, Dick Komer, as well, because some of those challenges are quite severe in terms of even the state constitutions.
Yes, absolutely. As occurred in New Hampshire, it's entirely possible that if you pass school choice legislation, whether a directly funded scholarship program or a tax credit funded scholarship program, the usual suspects, Americans United for Separation of Church and State, the ACLU, the teachers unions, the School Boards Association, they are more likely than not they will file a lawsuit against the program alleging that it violates some sort of state constitutional provision. In New Hampshire, it was a Blaine Amendment, and I think there's 38 to 40 states that have Blaine Amendments in their constitutions, but any number of things can be thrown in an effort to derail the program.
Now, at the oral argument at the New Hampshire Supreme Court, one of the justices there referred to attenuation, that is the separation between the state and these scholarships. And it almost seemed to be, well, there's clearly a thread running from the state to these scholarships, but let's talk about this attenuation, an attempt to, as Alex, the attorney for Americans United, described, diverting funds that otherwise would be going to public schools. Can you talk about that, just that argument a little bit?
Sure. I mean, we have always argued, those of us who are in favor of school choice programs, that when you provide scholarships to families, that breaks any sort of link between the state aiding religion. And we believe that in particular with tax credit programs, that relationship is even more attenuated because it's not using state money. The state, just as they do through the tax code, which encourages donations, deductions for donations to charitable organizations, here is providing taxpayers with a tax credit. And the money that actually funds the scholarship is donations made to scholarship granting organizations. And that further attenuates the relationship between the state and whatever school may ultimately receive the money, particularly religious schools, because with Blaine Amendments and with the federal Constitution's Establishment Clause, the focus is on the religious schools and the aspect of religious versus non-religious schools.
All right. The California Association of Private School Organizations, CAPSO, asks, to what extent did your advocacy efforts succeed in turning around opposing votes? There were 2 votes in the state Senate, and they were different. The outcomes were different in order to override that governor's veto.
How much did the advocacy help turn votes around? A huge amount. In the House, like Jason said, it's 400 people, so it's hard to reach everybody. But what Jason didn't say is that in a House that big, a lot of people are just going to listen to people they trust to figure out how to vote. So you have to find out who those people are, and Jason, when he was in, was one of those. So he had a big impact because of that. So the House representative, Republican House representative that spoke against it in the House, when it went for a vote in the House and helped keep it from getting veto-proof, I took him aside and said, what do I need to do to get your support of this, and how can I fix any concerns? What are those concerns? And sat down and worked long with him to figure out what the concerns were. Some were not valid. Some were valid but improbable, like, you know, the fiscal impact of the local school districts. Mathematically, it just couldn't be more than a drop in the bucket. So we made that explicit in the bill, that if any school district lost in a certain 0.25% of their school budget because of this program, they'd get something to supplement that loss. Of course, that won't happen and hasn't happened.
All right, we have another question. Todd Kiefer asks, has anyone considered allowing individual taxpayers to donate to the scholarship fund for tax credits? And I think I can actually answer this one, which is without a personal income tax at the state level, which New Hampshire doesn't have, there's nothing to count against the donation to the scholarship organization. But for states that that do have personal income taxes, which is most states, is that a better way to go than, say, making it a corporate donation?
Well, just as good. And actually, there are a number of states that have individual tax credits, and there are some states, Georgia, Florida, Arizona, and several others, where they have both a corporate tax credit and an individual tax credit.
Well, I was going to say, no, doing it through an income tax is worse. You get rid of the income tax and then put the tax credit onto something else to do it right. But you know, I think we could do something through property tax. So you have to look at, you know, what are the tax mechanisms that are currently funding education in your particular state. For us at the state level, that was mainly the business income tax, so that's what we went after. At the local level, it's the property tax, which is a bigger portion and kind of a harder sell for people right off the bat, and more complicated. There had been a bill that I think it was in an opinion of the court, not a ruling, that the local property tax credit that somebody proposed was unconstitutional. I don't know how that was formatted, but my understanding is the way they were doing is, you know, you could send your own kid to a private school and somehow get a tax credit. I think if they went back and did something like that where you could donate, you know, anybody in the town could donate, so it was an opportunity for everybody to receive the tax credit to a scholarship organization that helped people in your town. I think that could work. So.
All right. David Lowenthal has a question related to this. We see growth in choice on the demand side, credits and ESAs, education savings accounts. Are we going to see liberty on the supply side, that is curriculum choice, et cetera? Jason?
Yes, actually, New Hampshire is at the forefront of this because New Hampshire has the first scholarship tax credit program that allowed homeschoolers to participate. And so homeschoolers are able to purchase homeschool curricula, hire a tutor, a whole bunch of things, textbooks, etc. There are also 2 states that have what are called education savings accounts, Arizona and Florida, where the state gives for a family that opts their child out of the public school, the state gives 90% of the portion that would have gone to that child directly to the parents. They have a debit card they can use for a number of expenses, like I mentioned, tuition, tutors, textbooks, online learning, and whatnot. So we're moving in that direction. There are a lot of legislatures around the country interested in that, and it'll allow families to really customize and tailor the education for the individual needs of their own children.
All right. Jody Sun asks, why is the limit $2,500? How can $2,500 help with tuition that costs $30,000, and then in parentheses KUA, or $15,000 public high school?
So actually, it's an average of $2,500. That was the maximum average, and that was done in order to make sure that the bill had fiscal savings. But if you look at the report, Choosing to Learn, at the Josiah Bartlett website, Josiah Bartlett Center website, there is an appendix that has all of the posted school tuitions in the top 10 most populous towns and cities in New Hampshire, and the average tuition was actually somewhere closer to about $5,000. So that $2,500 really can go a long way for families.
Okay, and you know, when I spoke with Brandon Fide and Sonia Brilidakis in New Hampshire, they both talked about, you know, it's a significant challenge to put together the kind of money that they both did have to put together, and that almost seems to the fact that families are directly investing in it, it seems like they are more invested in the outcomes as well. Yeah, can you talk about that a little bit?
I worked with a program in Colorado that did scholarships, but this was done purely privately. And that was something that they saw and they found is having skin in the game is an important thing. And these families do have skin in the game. I mean, when you're spending your own money you really think very carefully about what the best choice is. And it's interesting that very act of choice, I think, also often brings about improvements, just sitting there and thinking about it.
All right, Rob Rafferty asks, how do you respond to those who are skeptical of social policy through the tax code in general?
Well, I will just say in terms of this bill, we were concerned about that. In other words, you give a tax credit for a program like this, how do you ensure that the schools don't wind up getting regulated by it? First off, doing it through a tax credit as opposed to doing it through like a voucher helps that a lot, because you can say this is not public money. And that's the argument we continually used. And then also, we put in a lot of protections into the bill that says, that you can't further regulate any of these schools because they're part of this program. So I think it's something you have to be aware of, but what's the alternative?
This is really the opposite of social engineering when you think about it. The ultimate social engineering project is our public school system, where everybody is assigned to a school based on where they can live. And the government highly regulates what's taught, when it's taught, and how it's taught. Here we have a system, we are empowering families to choose to educate their children in the way that they see fit. So this really is the opposite of social engineering. This is empowering families to do what they want instead of what the government wants them to do.
All right. If you have a question for any of our guests, Dick Komer, Jim Forsythe, and Jason Bedrick about the New Hampshire Scholarship Tax Credit Program, especially for perhaps your state, you can use the hashtag CatoConnect on Twitter and ask your question. We'll try to get to, again, as many of those as possible in the next 20 minutes or so. What was the biggest challenge for you, Jim, at putting this piece of legislation together? I mean, over and above objection handling and that sort of thing, this is a very carefully designed program.
There was a significant amount of time. I mean, we had a conservative legislature, so the biggest challenge to us in getting this passed was really to show that it was something that was going to, be fiscally neutral or save money. Fiscally neutral and provide more choices, which is a better outcome. But at worst, fiscally neutral, hopefully save money. So that was a big challenge, and that's where my background in math helped a lot, because I was able to work with the Department of Education and try to ask, okay, how are you doing your analysis? Because they determine the fiscal note. So I worked a lot with the Department of Education to figure out how they do their analysis, and then to structure the program so that it would meet those needs. For example, there is an extra amount of money from the state that goes towards kids that are eligible for free and reduced lunches. So that means if one of those kids goes to a private school, we save more money. So we made that, and then if you look at these programs in other states, they're 50, 60, 80% of the scholarship recipients are on free and reduced lunch. But the DOE was using the numbers of the average number of students that would normally qualify, like 25%. So we built what we expected to happen, which is a lot of those students in the program. We built that into the legislation to make the fiscal impact more clear. So it became required that the scholarship organization have at least 40% in free and reduced lunch. And right now, in the first 2 years of the program, it's 80%.
It was 91 in the first year.
Yeah. So help me understand this argument, which was offered by your opponents, and I think continues to be offered, which is this is draining money from the public schools. And give us a comparison of the basic math associated with this kind of program.
So it was interesting because if you're talking about the person I think you're talking about, he brought in a spreadsheet and he used the argument that this program could increase 25% a year. 10 years down the road, there's 10, 20, 30,000 people in this program, and therefore we have this less tax revenue, et cetera, and so forth. So I asked, well, how many of those students are currently in private schools? Well, a couple thousand. So where did all these students come from? Well, public school. Well, public school costs on average $16,000 a student in New Hampshire. So if you've managed to move 30,000 people out of the public school system for $2,500, and that's not even $2,500 it's an 85% tax credit, so it's actually $2,100, $2,200 in reduced revenue. So if you've managed to move that many people into a private system for that little amount of money, that's a huge positive impact. So, you can't make an argument that $16,000 on average, and we're giving a scholarship for $2,500, and somehow that's going to tear apart the public school system.
Well, but the deeper concern of those people is that the pool of money that had been set aside specifically for spending on the public school system is no longer available because those students are being educated privately. I'm not trying to justify it, but that seems to be the deeper concern.
Well, I mean, even the way we structured it, it's still not a level playing field. You know, they're getting $16,000 versus $2,500, so there will always be plenty. With that kind of a structure, there'll always be plenty of kids in public school. But I guess I would ask the question is, why is it necessarily? I mean, as long as they're going to a school that works for them, what difference does it make what school they go for? Is there some inherent value for it being a public school system? I mean, obviously everybody needs to have an opportunity for good education, but whether that's the market or the public system. And I think, you know, some of the states that have had school choice programs for a long time have seen what happens traditionally is a program like this starts up and the public school systems respond. They improve they improve their outcomes and start to, actively keep the students in, and they have a better outcome. So,
built into the resource question is an assumption that there's a direct correlation between the resources a school has and the performance of that school. And that's just simply false. I mean, over and over, there have been studies on this. Eric Hanushek from Stanford found that that's just not the case. I mean, if that were the case, then Washington, D.C., at $30,000 per pupil per year, would have the best school system in the country instead of the worst school system in the country. There have been a number of studies of the impact on, actually almost 24 studies on the impact on public schools. Every single study so far has found a small but statistically significant impact, positive impact on public school performance after the introduction of a school choice program, except one which found no difference. So, I mean, it's very clear the public schools, as Jim said, once there's competition, the public schools are working to keep those kids. So not only is a school choice program good for the children who get to leave and go to the school that works best for them, it's actually also good for those students who stay behind. Because they have that option to leave, their voice is more powerful and the school is more responsive to them.
Dick Komer, we touched on this briefly beforehand, but how many states have these Blaine amendments? How many states have compelled support clauses? And break out what those things are for people who are interested in this kind of reform in their state.
Sure. So you've got 38 states with Blaine amendments that basically say no money shall be appropriated to the benefit of sectarian schools. That's the classic Blaine amendment.
And these emerged out of sort of anti-Catholic bias in
yes.
the 19th century, is that right?
That's correct. I mean, as the country became more religiously diverse and the monopoly of the Protestant majority over the public schools was challenged by the Catholics, the Catholics started setting up their own schools because the public schools, as generically Protestant institutions, were inhospitable to Catholic immigrant children. There actually was an effort to proselytize the Catholic kids and turn them into good Protestants. So the Catholics set up their own schools and started demanding that the public school funds be split between the Protestant public schools and the Catholic parochial schools. And in fact, this was very much the case in New Hampshire, where the Catholic immigrants were coming from Quebec and from Ireland. Both jurisdictions did in fact divide the school funds between Protestant and Catholic schools, and they were asking for the same thing here in the United States. And the response was immediate and unequivocal, which was no. We're going to reserve all of the school funds for the Protestant public schools, and if you don't like it, you can go to your own schools, but not with any state funding. That's what the basic Blaine Amendment does. Now, the compelled support provisions are older. There's about 27 of those. Some states have both, so you only have 3 states, Maine, Louisiana, and North Carolina, that have neither. And the compelled support clause just basically says that no person shall be compelled to support any church without his consent. These were originally sort of disestablishment provisions in state constitutions designed to eliminate the state religions, because at the time of the founding, New England had established the Congregationalist Church for most of the New England states. The southern states had established the Anglican Church, and everybody had to support those churches, sometimes even attend those churches. And these provisions were intended to eliminate established religion, but they have been construed occasionally by state Supreme Courts in much the same way as Blaine amendments can be construed to prohibit any aid to religious schools. Now, the problem for school choice programs under both is that school choice programs don't actually support or aid schools directly at all. They aid parents, and parents make the choice. And some states with good Blaine law interpret the provision to allow school choice programs. New York does. Pennsylvania does. These are states that have Blaine amendments. Pennsylvania's got a compelled support clause. And states can misinterpret compelled support clauses to be hostile to school choice also, as the state of Vermont did. So both of these sorts of provisions are subject to what I consider historical misinterpretations that serve to limit school choice programs. Properly construed, neither sort should in fact be interpreted to prohibit giving families a choice.
Well, let me ask you, as a related matter, and maybe this will help clarify the issue for some people who are watching tonight, how is it that we have a GI Bill that allows returning soldiers who are receiving some education benefits, how are they then able to attend religious schools?
Actually, because those were, that was a critical aspect that led the U.S. Supreme Court to interpret the federal Establishment Clause to permit school choice programs. There's a direct link through the cases between the GI Bill program and the Nyquist case, where they left a footnote saying the GI Bill is not threatened by this decision. And the subsequent decision in Zellman versus Simmons-Harris in 2002, upholding the Cleveland school choice program. Basically, it's the same principle. If you can use the GI Bill at a religious or non-religious college, then you should be able to use a K-12 scholarship at a religious or non-religious school.
All right, we have a...
Can I make
go
a
ahead,
real quick
please,
point
go
about
ahead.
that? So that's an interesting thing, because the current governor of New Hampshire proposed a bill to essentially provide scholarships for college students that could be used at a religious school. But she supported and put Bill Duncan on the board to try to get rid of this tax credit program. And I think that shows you I think the difference between how people approach K through 12 versus colleges has a lot to do with the unions and how they push for these kinds of things or push against them.
All right, we have a question from Chris Bossy McCoy. This seems like a great answer for homeschool parents. What are the odds of expanding it to other states? As we noted in the beginning of the film, this was a first of its kind reform in New Hampshire to include homeschooling parents. So Jim, how did that come about, and what do you think the odds are of expanding that type of tax credit program for homeschooling parents?
How that came about was simply, the core kind of writers of the bill were big supporters of homeschooler, including myself. My kids were homeschooled for, I think, 7 years. And I think we talked to Adam Schaefer about it and says, has this been done? How would you do this?
Adam Schaefer, who's an adjunct at Cato and was at the time full-time here at the Cato Institute.
So we thought of how could we do this, and we were careful about, we didn't want to provide a scholarship to pay the parents directly for their time, because that could set up a fairly strange incentive, to homeschool, whether or not you're actually, working hard on it. So, so we just from very early on try to figure out, how we'd put something like this in, and we chose to support the materials, buying this materials. I think it's easily expandable to other states. We didn't really face any opposition from it, other than the mechanics of, okay, are you paying these kids to, families just to stay at home? No, you're not. You're paying for the materials, and everybody's like, oh, okay, I'm fine with that.
We have a question from Kate Baker, who
Kate,
I strongly suspect is that Kate Baker.
Oh, I know her question. I'll answer it.
How does one make a contribution to support the New Hampshire Scholarship Program? Kate Baker, of course, runs the Network for Educational Opportunity and is very interested in finding out how people corporate taxpayers in New Hampshire can support her scholarship organization. But I want to note, hers was the first, but as of now, it is not the only scholarship organization operating in New Hampshire. So how does it function with corporate taxpayers trying to make these contributions?
Well, the answer to our first question is networkforeducation.org is where you would donate. I don't know the website for the other scholarship organization. I think they're catering towards religious schools. They had put in very early to do this, but then when the court case came down, they stopped, and they've been waiting, and so now they're back getting active. But the idea behind scholarship organizations is it adds a free market incentive in there to be able to have more than one. Unlike a voucher program where the government's handling the money, or if you were to contract out a single scholarship organization, you can understand how there'd be some chances of money to go missing that way. But when you have multiple competing scholarship organizations, there's a lot of scrutiny from the business owners to say, are you handling my funds well? Are you getting it to the right kids? And there's also an incentive to reduce your overhead because of that. So that's why we chose that format, and there was some ways to structure it so it worked reasonably well.
We have a statement from Brandon Fide, who lives in northern New Hampshire. He says, "Great work, gentlemen. Thank you. I pay a lot of taxes. Meanwhile, I'm saving my town $15,500 in tuition to a neighboring high school." Well, and I think that's sort of an undersold element of this, which is overall spending on education under this program. Overall spending goes up.
That's right. You're pulling kids out for a very small fraction of the price. So there's overall more money. Plus, the parents are throwing in their money. The businesses are adding a little bit of money. So overall spending on education goes up. But yeah, one of the other state senators who's supportive of the program, I think he had 10 kids. Fenton had something like 10 kids, all homeschooled. And he made the point. I saved the state $160,000 a year. He says, and I don't want any of that money back. My kids aren't getting a scholarship. We can afford it. But, please help some families that can't afford it. I mean, the burden these families take on and the burden they relieve on the taxpayer is huge.
Charity Wolf asks a question finally, how can the learning disabled benefit from this kind of tax credit?
I think there's a really good opportunity. We've seen that amongst private schools, there is a much higher satisfaction rate. I mean, you're going to have to search for a school that's more custom for what you're looking for. But the satisfaction rate in public schools for special ed is really low, and it surprises people that it's as high as it is in the private schools. Jason probably has the data on that. I can't pull it off the top of my head, but we did structure one thing into the bill because special ed kids receive $1,850 more in state aid on average. So we structured in the bill that you could get those kids could get increased scholarships because of that.
Right, and again, this is this case where every single student benefits. I mean, you often hear from the public schools, oh, these special ed kids, they're way too expensive. We don't get enough money from the state to educate them. It's a real drain on our resources. But then when you give those students the opportunity to leave, and they take not only their base allocation, but also the additional allocation from the state for the special ed services, and they say, okay, we're leaving, and that school is no longer going to get that, suddenly the schools figure, oh, actually, you know what? It is cost effective for us to educate that kid, and they want to compete for those kids. And we've seen actually in a number of states where that's exactly been the case, that those families are better off in the public schools after the program, because the public schools are now trying to cater to them because they have the option to leave and go somewhere else.
Because there is so much money that is effectively attached to learning disabled children from state and federal government.
Right, and when there's competition, the schools suddenly figure out, actually, we are able to provide you high quality service at the amount of money that we're getting.
All right, as we close up here, I do want to ask each of you, if you had a message for state lawmakers in other states that are considering this kind of thing and don't really know where to begin, what do you tell them?
Well, I'm always happy to take calls or to talk to people about my experience, but the biggest help for us was really the analysis and the data, and really that was Adam Schaefer and Jason Bedrick. You know, he did surveys of Pennsylvania scholarship organizations. So there's a lot of material out there for figuring out what are the different options for doing this, what are the benefits, you know, answering people's concerns and all that stuff. So you definitely need to do your homework and be ready to answer all those different questions, and Cato's a great resource for that.
For lawmakers, it's good policy and it's good politics. Go out there, do it. Feel free to contact the Cato Institute. You can reach me at jbedrick@cato.org, and I'm happy to speak to any lawmaker who's interested.
All right, well, hey,
and
Dick, you want to throw in on that? Go right ahead.
Yes, I do, because lawmakers need to know that because of these Blaine amendments and compelled support clauses, that sometimes a particular sort of school choice program may not be a good idea for your state because it is likely to fail a legal challenge. But I'm happy to say that there's really only 1 or 2 states that I can name that can't use some form of school choice from a legal perspective. And they're, you know, only if you're in Michigan and Kentucky should you automatically just say, the hell with it.
Right. Speaking as a Kentuckian, I probably agree with you. So thank you very much for joining us for this edition of Cato Connects. The film Live Free and Learn, Scholarship Tax Credits in New Hampshire is now available on YouTube, so feel free to share that with your friends or any interested parties. And as always, if you have any questions about this issue or related issues relating to educational freedom, visit our website, cato.org.